In December 1940, the British government classified a man as a friendly enemy alien permitted to remain free, but barred from owning a camera, a map, or a bicycle without police permission. 8 months earlier, that same man had handwritten 3 pages of mathematics that calculated, for the first time anywhere in the world, the critical mass needed to build an atomic bomb. His name was Rudolf Peierls. His collaborator, Otto Frisch, had been briefly interned as an enemy national the previous year, held behind barbed wire on the Isle of Man, while his own physics was about to reshape the war he'd been arrested in connection with. Britain was, simultaneously, suspicious of these men and dependent on them. That contradiction sat at the center of the British file for decades. It still isn't fully resolved. This is the story of how a nation under nightly bombing, fighting alone, funded and built the conceptual foundation of the nuclear age, and then, within 3 years, lost control of it entirely. Not through betrayal, through arithmetic. Frisch and Peierls were both refugees from Nazi Germany, both Jewish, both physicists who had fled before the war and found posts at British universities, Frisch at Birmingham, working under Mark Oliphant. In March 1940, barred from radar work because of their enemy alien status, the irony being that the most sensitive military research was closed to them while the most consequential was not, they turned to a problem nobody had been tasked with solving: how much uranium-235 would actually be needed to sustain an explosive chain reaction. The figure they produced was startling. Not tons, as earlier estimates assumed. Kilograms. A weapon that could fit in an aircraft. Peierls wrote up the memorandum longhand. There was no typing pool cleared to handle it. The document went to Oliphant, who recognized immediately that it could not sit in a desk drawer. Both men, technically enemy aliens, were not even permitted to see the final classified version of their own work once it entered the British security apparatus. Frisch's habit, documented by colleagues, was to work late into the evening in an unheated lab, partly from dedication, partly because Birmingham in 1940 offered little else to do after blackout fell. The last ordinary moment, if there was one, was the morning Oliphant carried the memorandum to Henry Tizard's scientific committee, before either Frisch or Peierls had any sense of what bureaucratic life their 3 pages were about to acquire. The Frisch-Peierls memorandum reached the Maud Committee within weeks. The committee's final report, delivered in July 1941, was unambiguous. A bomb was feasible, deliverable within 2 to 3 years, and Britain should build it. This is the detail that doesn't survive in the popular memory of the war. Britain did not join an American bomb program. Britain's scientific establishment concluded, independently and first, that the weapon was buildable, before the United States had reached the same level of technical certainty. By August 1941, the program had a name designed to mean nothing: tube alloys. The code name appeared on requisitions, personnel files, and correspondence as though it referred to industrial piping. Wallace Akers, a chemicals executive from ICI, was brought in to direct it, a detail historians still debate, since it placed a private sector industrialist in charge of what was, in effect, the world's first state nuclear weapons directorate. What the surviving tube alloys files show is a program racing against its own resource ceiling. Britain had the physics. It did not have the industrial capacity to build isotope separation plants at the scale required, not while diverting steel, skilled labor, and electricity to aircraft production and convoy escorts under sustained Luftwaffe pressure. The Maud report itself acknowledged the gap obliquely, recommending cooperation with the United States almost in the same breath as recommending British construction, a hedge that reads, in hindsight, like an admission. In 1942, a British scientific mission traveled to the United States to assess the American effort, by then folded into what would become the Manhattan Project. The mission's internal reports back to London register something close to disbelief. American funding, plant construction, and personnel numbers were not incrementally larger than Britain's. they were operating on an entirely different order of magnitude. One figure circulated in Whitehall at the time. The cost of the American program by 1943 exceeded Britain's entire wartime expenditure on radar. This wasn't a story of one ally outworking another. It was a story of a country being bombed nightly trying to outfund a country that wasn't. There's a great deal more in the declassified tube Alloy's files about exactly how London weighed its options that year, and the record is more revealing than most accounts let on. If the documentary trail behind decisions like this is what keeps you watching this channel, subscribing means you won't miss where the file goes next. What the file goes next to is the Quebec Agreement, signed in August 1943 by Churchill and Roosevelt. Britain agreed to merge tube alloys into the Manhattan Project. The agreement included a clause, Article 5, restricting Britain's post-war use of nuclear information without American consent. At the time, this read as a reasonable wartime concession in exchange for access to resources Britain could not otherwise generate. British scientists, Peierls and Frisch among them, relocated to Los Alamos and other American sites. Chadwick led the British mission. William Penny worked on weapon design and would later witness the Trinity test directly. This was not erasure. British names appear throughout the Manhattan Project's internal documentation, but the decision-making center of gravity had shifted permanently to Washington, and Britain had agreed to that shift in writing. Here's where the post-war record breaks from the wartime one. The 1946 Atomic Energy Act, the McMahon Act, passed by the U.S. Congress, restricted the sharing of nuclear research with any foreign power, Britain included, regardless of the Quebec Agreement or Britain's contribution to the underlying science. Overnight, the country that had produced the first feasibility assessment of an atomic weapon, that had helped staff the laboratories that built it, was legally barred from the technical knowledge it had helped generate. What followed wasn't outrage. It was reconstruction. Clement Attlee's government authorized an independent British weapons program almost immediately, run separately from the wartime apparatus and kept secret even from most of cabinet, a decision that itself wasn't disclosed to Parliament in full until years later. Britain detonated its first atomic device in October 1952 off the coast of Western Australia, having effectively rebuilt from its own 1941 starting point. The documented sequence is not America stole British science. It's that Britain led the science, was outpaced by American industrial capacity it could not match while under bombardment, agreed by treaty to merge programs, and was then cut out by domestic American legislation that didn't honor the spirit of that treaty. The McMahon Act's exclusion was eventually loosened. The 1958 US-UK Mutual Defense Agreement restored a measure of nuclear cooperation, after Britain had already proven independent capability. Frisch and Peierls both returned to British academic life. Neither received public recognition during the war commensurate with what their 1940 memorandum had set in motion, in part because the work remained classified for decades. Peierls' own later writing on the period is measured rather than bitter, noting the strategic logic of merger even while acknowledging the post-war exclusion stung. What official post-war British accounts tend to omit, or compress into a single sentence, is the period between 1943 and 1946, when British physicists were central contributors to a program whose ownership had already passed elsewhere, and the subsequent legislative act that treated that contribution as though it hadn't happened. Frisch spent part of 1940 unable to own a camera without police permission, while doing the arithmetic that opened the nuclear age. That contradiction, trusted with the most dangerous calculation of the century, distrusted with a bicycle, says something about how Britain held its own scientists at arm's length even while depending on them completely. The country that started the race didn't lose it through carelessness or theft. It ran out of room to finish on its own terms. What's left in the files is not a clean villain. It's a timeline of decisions, each defensible in isolation, that together meant the nation that proved the bomb was possible wasn't the one that got to decide, alone, what came next.